go, Barbara.
Yes, as so often.
A professional audience. I know, it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. What more can we ask? No, I was just saying to Barbara to encourage her that we're getting quite a lot of views of these online. Yeah. You know, people are watching it online. There's you know, some of them have well over 50 people watching. Right. So it's just that people don't always want to come in, but they're happy to watch it in their own homes. Well, that's we just raced back from a care home to get here. Oh, God bless you. Part-time running more than visiting of the other ones. All right. Well, no idea how many watch on the street. I brought a few for the chapel for today. I will be able to tell you, actually. Yes, I'll be able to tell you at the end. Although on summer afternoon, that's right. We want to sit down and watch telly. Exactly. You never know. But we'll see. Let me know when you want to start. You can start whenever you like. I thought if we took for the chapel for tomorrow night, doesn't seem to get there, does it?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. We come now to session number 32, and it's entitled The Hasmoneans. As you can see from the title page. Well, we've lived through some tumultuous years, as you can remember, starting with that dreadful year 167 BCE. And for 30 years, the Jews suffered. But in 134, they had at long last become a politically independent kingdom again. Hooray! All should have been well. They should have initiated good policies which would have brought the benefits of their law for all their people, but they were still only human and didn't seem to have learnt any lessons from their own experiences in the past. The nickname Maccabee, which we encountered last time, applies only to old Mattathias and his sons, Judas, Jonathan, and Simon. They were from the less sophisticated countryside, but motivated by religious needs for survival after 167. But their sons, of the third generation, had acquired a liking for the high life of power and were determined to keep hold of it for themselves. They lost sight of their family's allegiance to religious customs and standards of God's law and clung on to political power at all costs. Just as old Mattathias' grandson, whether the Jews liked it or not, we finished last time, just as old Mattathias' grandson, John Hyrcanus, grasped power and declared himself both high priest and king, although in Jewish terms he had no qualifications for either position. Now, John Hyrcanus, picture coming up, we get these pictures, tracings of coins that were minted in the reign of, with a picture of the king in the middle, and round the outside some writing, and if you can decipher it, you can see on the right-hand side, Hyrcanus. And on the left-hand side, IVD is the old transcription for JUD, Judea. So Hyrcanus of Judea. Well, John Hyrcanus was not a pious Jew. He was politically astute, and he reigned for 30 years, thanks to his first move of recognizing the power of the up-and-coming Empire of Rome. During his reign, Syria was in decline, with weak leadership and too many internal problems, and John Hyrcanus did no more than send an embassy to Rome itself with delightful presents. And his reward was great. Rome confirmed his independence and warned the Syrians to leave the Jews alone, and all should have been well. But John Hyrcanus wasted no time. He was a soldier, not a religious man, and he led a series of military campaigns with the help of non-Jewish mercenaries. And he succeeded in extending his borders, because for Judea was still a tiny little group of villages around the city of Jerusalem. It was still quite tiny. But from now on, we begin to see how Judea became the place which is now familiar to us when we read the Gospels. So each little step, note, oh yes, that'll matter when we get to the New Testament. Well, John Hyrcanus wasted no time. First, there's the map. Let's look at it because I couldn't get exactly the map I wanted. You can see the River Jordan running down the middle, the Sea of Galilee, the second from the top, and the Dead Sea down at the bottom. And Jerusalem was just to the left of the top of the Dead Sea. Don't think you can see it. So that's Jerusalem, and the little part around it was the original Judea of John Hyrcanus. But first, he conquered the ancient town of Shechem. Now, from Jerusalem in that map, go upwards to the left into the middle. And that's where Shechem is. And if you remember, that was the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel years and years and years ago. But he conquered that again. And it had originally, a long time ago, been the center of the Jewish story. But this city was now populated by what we call half-Jews. Those people, if you remember, who's offered to help rebuild the temple in Jerusalem when Nehemiah told them to go away because they weren't proper Jews. Well, they went away, 3 centuries earlier, in a huff, went to Shechem. They'd left Jerusalem, and Shechem, which is very close to the site of old Samaria, the old capital of the northern kingdom, and they built a temple of their own on Mount Gerizim. They disliked the Jerusalem Jews ever since. And here we get the beginning of the Samaritan-Jew divide. But John Hyrcanus wasted no time. He subdued them. He destroyed their temple and also the Greek city which had replaced the old city site of Samaria. Consequently, their dislike turned to hatred. And we now know of them as the Samaritans. Secondly, John Hyrcanus moved south. And you take your bearings from Jerusalem again and go southwards, downwards, but not as far as the purple strip. But that part to the south of Jerusalem was an area known as Idumea. And John Hyrcanus conquered them. They had taken possession of the southern area of Judah when the exile to Babylon had reduced the numbers, and they had moved in instead. And then John Hyrcanus instituted a new policy for all his newly conquered territories. They were to be incorporated into his kingdom as proper Jews. How? Well, answer. All the men and the boys were forcefully circumcised, whether they liked it or not. And all this while John Hyrcanus himself became more and more like a Greek aristocrat. The danger of this eventful story of upstart family clinging to power, dramatic and eventful as it was, is that we forget the ordinary people over whom they held sway. Yet this Bible story is the story of the faith of these ordinary people. So let's consider what was happening to them. In years gone by, when Antiochus IV had tried to exterminate all loyal practicing Jews, it had weakened the faith of those who didn't care very much, namely the Hellenizers who liked the good life. But it had strengthened others from all walks of life who were determined to preserve their way of life. Some priests became more and more zealous in the performance of their temple duties, while the Levites and others in the countryside suffered the shock of martyrdom. I expect you all remember that. The survivors' faith became intensified, some of them becoming, as we heard last session, into the group known as the Pious Ones, who had originally supported the Maccabean revolt until it became too political. And in all this, the survivors had begun to write prophetically again, producing the coded story of Daniel and other writings in the apocalyptic style, while exploring the likelihood that there was some form of life after death, where God's martyrs could receive their reward. When the persecution had stopped and the younger Maccabees became the high priest, they didn't like it. The zealous priests, because they were not Zadokite priests, and the pious ones who felt so badly that this was a betrayal of all they'd stood for. They had opted out and become the original members of the monastic movement known as the Essenes of Qumran. I don't know how much you know about Qumran, but there are the caves. It's a real rocky place to the northeast of the Dead Sea. Really is wild. You can imagine groups of refugees hiding amongst those hills and being very hard to find. That's as it looks today. There are the archaeological remains of the settlement they made. And we believe that that settlement was a group of people we know as the Essenes. And they had cut themselves off from temple worship, and they just became absorbed into that monastic settlement and lived very quietly. But they were known and not forgotten. Well, our knowledge of this time in history now comes mainly from the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus. He was the first to use two descriptive names that are very familiar to us from the New Testament, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Sadducees, picture of them, were mainly the zealous priests who guarded all the temple rites and customs. They were noble, well-to-do, and prominent citizens of Jerusalem. But we know very little about them because both they and all their writings were eventually destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. That was when the whole of Jerusalem was burnt to the ground. But these Sadducees were mainly conservative in their thinking. They were the intelligentsia, scribes, teachers of wisdom, and they all enjoyed a comfortable way of life in Jerusalem. And they had no need to take on the new ideas of resurrection after death. Didn't matter, wasn't important. The Pharisees, by contrast, were the inheritors of the law-keeping ordinary Jewish people. They had come to believe in some sort of resurrection life after death. They were usually well educated in the Jewish law. And some were even scribes, because reading is much, much easier than being able to write it, so scribes come second. But sadly, we have no knowledge about how one became a Pharisee, or what they did once they had become recognized as such. They were certainly a group of loyal Jews whose pursuit was righteousness rather than political influence. Sadly, our Gospels are full of criticism of them as a group, mainly because of their outward, pious and flamboyant behavior in public. Remember, though, for the future, that they did believe in the resurrection after death, unlike the Sadducees. Then we must not forget the humble village Levites, or the rabbis, who worked in the synagogues. They quietly maintained village worship and life through the synagogues and, as you can see in the picture, taught the youngsters the basics of the law and the prophets, teaching them to read and sometimes to be able to write. And we must always remember with gratitude the eventual faithful rabbi of that synagogue in Nazareth who taught the young Jesus. And there, just for your information, is a reconstruction of the synagogue at Nazareth. Very simple, a hall with windows up above and pillars in the middle and the seats on benches round the edge. Very simple. That's where the villagers would gather with the rabbi to worship on the Sabbath day. Well, at first, King John Hyrcanus was favourably inclined towards the Pharisees. But as he grew more and more to enjoy the high society life of Hellenism, he broke with them. And Josephus tells us a story. It happened at a banquet when John Hyrcanus asked members of both parties to assure him that he was indeed a good keeper of the Jewish law. And one Pharisee, named Eleazar, stood up and challenged him to give up his role as high priest and be content with the civil leadership of the people. And when asked to explain why, he replied that John Hyrcanus wasn't born to hold such high office as high priest. He was not amused. In fact, he was incensed and switched his allegiance and his favoritism to the Sadducees instead. And an anti-Pharisee mood began to develop. Well, John Hyrcanus came to his death in 104 BC, and then more political turbulence ensued. His son Aristobulus I, and I think you got the time chart last time you came, and it's very, very involved. While writing this, I had to keep on going back and checking my dates and names and everything else. Don't worry if you get confused. His son Aristobulus I was not only ambitious, but he was cruel. His first action was to imprison his mother and starve her for death, because he didn't like her. He then imprisoned all his brothers. And when one of them had a family who plotted against him, that brother was executed. No problem. He had an army and went northwards, and let's have a look at the map again, went northwards into Galilee. Now in this map you can see the Sea of Galilee in the middle, and the River Jordan going down south towards the Dead Sea, and that whole area is labelled Galilee, from the Sea of Galilee to the Mediterranean coast. Quite a large area. But the Jews didn't live there. It was the Iturean people who lived there. But the king forced all of them to become Jews again by circumcision, thus enlarging his state to a much bigger size, and with many new Jews, some of whom were no doubt reluctant to be so absorbed. And again, remember our comment in our Gospels, can anything good come out of Galilee? Well, there is your explanation. But fortunately, Aristobulus reigned for only 1 year. His widow, a formidable lady named Salome Alexandra, there she is, Alexandra on the right, Judea on the left, from a coin she minted. His widow, Salome Alexandra, set free all his surviving brothers who were still in prison. She chose one of them and married him, and made him the next king. So she really was quite a woman. He straightway took the Greek form of his name, Alexander Gennaeus, and ruled from 103 to 76 BCE. So we're now moving into the eventful 1st century BCE. Well, Alexander Gennaeus, let's have a look at him. There he is, formidable. No doubt did what his wife told him. But when he was on his own, he was the boss. He was another ruthless person, too, for whom self-survival was his top priority. With Salome, also a strong survivor in this turbulent world, they made a formidable pair. Their first act was to kill any others of those brothers who might challenge them. And together, they reached the zenith of Hasmonean rule. Egypt and Syria were weak at the time, and the might of the Roman legions hadn't yet made their impact. The king was more of a soldier than a high priest, his personal life being that of a drunkard on a grand scale. Nevertheless, the Jewish state continued to expand with the conquest of the land to the east of Galilee. Let's have a look at that map again. This is the purple area to the right of the Sea of Galilee. And in the time of Jesus, that was all part of the Judea that he, the kingdom that he knew. That's the purple bit at the top that he added. That was the land east of Galilee on the other side of the River Jordan. With its peoples, we've heard of these in the Old Testament, the old enemies, the Moabites, Gileadites, and so on, all now circumcised as Jews. And he also took over Idumea in the far south. That's the purple bit. He appointed a local leader of the Idumeans, a man called Antipas, to be its governor. And please remember for the future. But it was the Nabateans of Petra in the far south, however, who ambushed the king and nearly killed him. But Alexander Jannaeus escaped, only to return to Jerusalem and trigger off a civil war. At the Feast of Tabernacles, Alexander Jannaeus, as high priest, made a ritual mistake. He poured water over his own feet instead of over the altar. The Pharisees just ridiculed him. They incited the people to hurl insults at him, and they were all holding lemons, and they were incited to throw all the lemons they were holding at the king. He was not amused. He set his mercenary soldiers on them, and we're told 6,000 of them were killed. Well, after that, Jerusalem was quiet for a little while, but only until 94 BCE, when the enraged Pharisees again rose up against the king. The civil war was ignited again for another 6 years, in the course of which, so we're told, 50,000 people died. What a political muddle. In the year 88, a big battle took place. A big battle took place near Shechem. The Jews and the Syrians won. Jews and Syrians won. But Alexander Jannaeus escaped and fled to the hills, where he was joined by other Jews who were appalled at the thought of being dominated by Syria again. And the Jews suddenly realized their own predicament. Whose side should they follow? Would they prefer to be ruled by Alexander Jannaeus, whom they just fought and beaten, or by the hated Seleucids of Syria again? Either way, they were trapped. They reluctantly threw in their lot with Alexander Jannaeus, but while King Demetrius III of Syria beat a hasty retreat, Alexander wreaked his revenge on them. Ruthless extermination was again the order of the day for all who didn't reach the hills or emigrate. Some more of the emigrants went to Qumran and became not members of the monastic community, but they added a lay community just by the monastery. So Qumran's numbers escalated. And in a fragment of papyrus found there last century, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which they eventually hid, there's an interesting comment on one of the fragments about Alexander Jannaeus. And I quote, "He hanged living men on wood," which was formerly not done in Israel. And please note at this time that crucifixion was not invented by the Romans. Also note that this was a calculated insult to the pious law-keeping Pharisees, and I quote from the law of Deuteronomy in chapter 21, quote, "When someone is convicted of a crime punishable by death and is executed and you hang him on a tree, his corpse must not remain all night upon the tree. You shall bury him that same day. For anyone hanged on a tree is cursed by God." What an ominous statement. And we shall meet the implications of this statement when we eventually meet St. Paul in his early years. Well, Josephus tells us that 800 people, men, were all crucified together, while their wives and children were forced to stand and watch. And if this was not bad enough, the crucifixions took place sufficiently close to the palace windows, through which they were visible to all the guests at a royal banquet. and the dying were near enough to hear all the music and laughter amid the clash of plates on the tables before the drunken orgy reached its height. Well, after all that, there was no more insurrection during this king's reign. Alexander Jannaeus so continued his military exploits and successfully captured Pella from the Nabateans, together with several other smaller territories. Now, Judea was now at the peak of its political expansion. But by this time, the king was 49 years old and had been ill for 3 years. Drunkenness, we ask? Liver failure? We don't know. But he died in the year 76 BCE. His widow, that indomitable Salome Alexandra, asserted herself again, and she became the sole ruler for the next 7 years, while her eldest son, Hyrcanus II, happily preferred to be merely the high priest. That suited him. It suited his mother very well as well. But she, being a woman, could only hold power while she could command the majority support of the people. So she did a complete U-turn in her policies. She recalled all the surviving Pharisees. She made them welcome. She gave them presents. She persuaded her high priest son to embrace Pharisaism for himself. And then she reorganized the governing council, the Sanhedrin, to have an equal number of Pharisees and Sadducees in its membership, to the great chagrin of the Sadducees. The ordinary people, though, fully approved of all this, and then at last there was peace and tranquility for several years in Jerusalem. And here begins the golden age of the Pharisees. Their leader was Simon ben Shita, and he established Pharisaic schools in Jerusalem. Remember, Jesus attended one when he visited the Jerusalem at the age of 12. And later Paul studied with them when he was a student there. Well, these schools produced students who became a well-educated middle-class strata in Jewish society, well trained by Pharisees with their emphasis on teaching the law of God and its interpretation in everyday practice. Well, at last, life was looking up again in Jerusalem. But in the course of their teaching, however, the Pharisees were developing an extended version of the law. We know it as the oral law, which came into being, working out in minute detail what the law approved of and what it didn't. For example, should one eat an egg that had been laid on the Sabbath day? Or if one's donkey needed a drink, could one draw water for it from the well on the Sabbath day? And in all, they gradually created several hundreds more do's and don'ts, governing people's lives on the Sabbath day. So many, in fact, that it all became too big a burden for most of them. Hence some of Jesus' criticisms of them. The Pharisees in general, though, approved of all this, along with the newer ideas of angels, archangels, and resurrection after death. Not so the Sadducees. They remained the opposition to these ideas in the Jewish council. And remember, they were equally balanced. And the Pharisaic influence spread out from Jerusalem to the villages and to the towns throughout the enlarged territories of the new kingdom of Judea. And most village synagogues, and certainly at Nazareth, the rabbis ran schools for the boys. They learned to recite some of the Old Testament scrolls, usually the Psalms, the book of Deuteronomy, and one of the prophets at least, all off by heart. Wonderful as it was, no, it did not last. Trouble was brewing among the Pharisees, who themselves were only too human at times. Power corrupts, as we know too well. And so it did for some of the powerful Pharisees who could neither forgive nor forget the time when so many of them being crucified in the reign of Alexander Jannaeus. They remembered how the Sadducees had done nothing to help them in their distress, and revenge became the order of the day, and there were yet more killings in Jerusalem. The beleaguered Sadducees then enlisted the support of the young Prince Aristobulus, who denounced his aging mother, the indomitable Salome Alexandra, and made off to the south with some Sadducean soldiers and took over several fortresses on the southern border. While he was there, his mother, Salome, now aged 73, became ill, and Aristobulus realized it was time to start asserting himself. And by the time she died in 67, he was ready. His older brother, that shy high priest Hyrcanus II, was about to assume the title of king when Aristobulus invited him to a meeting at Jericho. Remember, they were brothers. At Jericho, Aristobulus persuaded all Hyrcanus' supporters to support him because he was stronger, could do more. And then Aristobulus then forced his mild brother to relinquish both titles, king and high priest. And then he could live. How nice. He could live. On condition, of course, that he would promise to take no further part in public life. And he happily agreed. So in the year 67, Aristobulus II became both the new king and high priest. And all might possibly have gone well, except for a newcomer on the scene. Oh, I didn't show you Aristobulus II. There he was, the one who bullied his brother and took his role. Well, all might have gone well, except for that newcomer on the scene, Antipater. Antipater, here he is. He was the son of that original Antipas. He'd inherited the job of governor from his father and was now in control. He and his family chose to rekindle the claims of that retired weakling, Hyrcanus, who'd retired. They decided to bring him back again into the public area and support him as the rightful king. Oh, not for his sake. Oh, no. But for their own. And there we must leave it till next time, when we shall have Antipater and Hyrcanus versus Aristobulus. There'll be more fireworks, I assure you. But we'll leave it till then. Next time, the fortnight's time, 16th of July at 4:30. I hope to see you all then, and in the meantime, have a good time. Goodbye. Goodbye to all who are watching as well. Bye.